The United States is looking at an actual sovereign debt crisis. Is nothing like what it's experienced any time in the past. Not like it was in 2020, not like it was the financial crisis, not like it was in the 70s, 40s, World War II, the Great Depression, anything like that. The situation that we're in is very unique in terms of the severity of how bad things are. The United States will be faced with either default on their expenses or their debt, or inflate away the debt and start printing money to cover it up again. We're heading into a deleveraging recession. It'll either be inflationary or deflationary. Central banks use the monopoly on violence to force other people to do something they want them to do. It's financial tyranny. It's 100% authoritarian control over everything everybody does in an economy.
Why end the Fed?
Number one, they do that job that doesn't need to be done. They're there, essentially, to be a lender of last resort, which inherently means they're there to subsidize failure. If failure is allowed, the entire system gets stronger. Anytime you limit the consequences of individual failure, you make the entire system more unstable and more fragile, susceptible to collapse. And that's the job of the Federal Reserve. That's what they do. And it's just now that we're starting to see the effects of that really unfold on a grand scale.
Welcome to the Microscopic Podcast presented by GoldRepublic. My name is Alexey Jordanov, and in this format, I invite you to look at the world through different lenses to see what's hidden in plain sight. We'll dive deep to understand the forces that drive macroeconomics, financial markets, and the nature of money with alternative assets like gold, silver, and cryptocurrencies. We'll also investigate how geopolitics and power games shape the world we live in, but also what can we learn from history to understand the present and prepare for the future. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome Joe Brown, an educator, investor, and the man behind the YouTube channel Heresy Financial. With more than 220,000 subscribers, Joe shares regular insightful videos about how money works and how to secure your financial future. I followed Joe for years, and I can say he has an incredible talent to transform complex financial topics into super entertaining videos that are easy to understand. In this conversation, we talk about a catastrophic crisis coming to the United States that could plunge the global power into defaulting on its debt in the coming 5 years. Also, why Joe believes the Fed and central banks are useless and only exist to fuel wars and manipulate prices. But also how central bank digital currencies could lead to economic instability, reduced privacy, and increased authoritarian control. Next to that, we also talk about the challenges and uncertainties of gold-backed currencies and the BRICS' immense challenge to dethrone the dollar. Hope you get fresh insights and enjoy this conversation. If you do, please like and subscribe. Leave a reaction down below and share it to those who need to hear this. And as a little thank you gift, we'd like to give you 1 free gram of gold worth 60 euros if you open an account at GoldRepublic. Click the link in the description down below. Welcome to Microscopic, Joe.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. Last time we spoke to each other was also quite a while ago. It was more than 2 years ago, and things happened in those 2 years. My first question to you would be, what have markets not priced in yet, in your opinion? What is your most contrarian, heretic macro thesis?
First of all, I think it's I like the way that you framed that question because by definition, the thing that markets have not priced in yet must be the most contrarian or heretical opinion position, because the markets are an aggregate measure of an opinion of how things are going to unfold. I think the biggest one, and this is the most significant, I think this is going to be the most significant macro force over the next at least decade, probably longer, is the fiscal situation in the United States. The United States is looking at an actual sovereign debt crisis. And the reality is the position that the United States is in right now, financially speaking, is nothing like what it's experienced any time in the past. Not like it was in 2020, not like it was the financial crisis, not like it was in the 70s, the 40s, World War II, the Great Depression, anything like that. The situation that we're in is very unique in terms of the severity of how bad things are. Very basically, the situation that we're in, we have $32 trillion worth of debt. That's just the principal on the debt. When you add in the amount of interest that has to get paid back on that, it's obviously much higher. When you add in the off-balance sheet debt, meaning unfunded liabilities, the things that the government will have to pay for that is not like formally debt, things like how much they know they'll have to pay in Social Security, in Medicare, things like that. The number ranges, but it's well north of 100 trillion, probably over 200 trillion. So we've got big bills to pay. That's the first part of this. The second part of this is that most of the United States debt right now was borrowed at rates that were as low as interest rates can go, as low as they've been in history. So imagine you make $100,000 in income and you borrow $120,000 worth of debt and your interest rate is 1%. That's probably manageable for you. Although the payment's going to be steep just because the debt amount is so much. Now imagine that interest rate on your debt moves up to 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%. And every time a bill comes due, you don't have enough income to cover it. So you swipe a credit card to pay off the old credit card bill. And that new credit card has a higher interest rate than your old credit card. So every time you have to pay off old debt with new debt, your cost of that total debt goes up because your interest rate is increasing. That's the position the United States government is in right now. They borrowed a lot at really low interest rates, at the lowest they can go. And now interest rates are a lot higher. The interest portion of the United States government debt last year was around 400 billion. Right now, it's just a tad under 1 trillion. So it's over doubled. And the worst part is this is the beginning. So in the next 2 years, most of the government's debt, the U.S. government's debt is short-term duration. So it will mature within the next 2 years. Half of the government's debt will mature within the next 2 years. We know that they can't pay that off with taxes because they're running a deficit, which means they're borrowing new debt to pay off old debt. So half of the government's debt, about $16 trillion, is going to get replaced with $16 trillion more worth of debt. But instead of being at 2% interest, it's going to be at 4, 5, or 6% interest. So the interest cost on the government's debt is going to go from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion within the next 2 years. And that's just the interest on the debt. This has nothing to do with Social Security. This has nothing to do with Medicare. This has nothing to do with military spending, nothing to do with any other spending the government is doing, which is going up every year by itself. Just the interest on the debt is quickly going to become the largest line item on the budget. And there's no way to slow this down. There's no way to stop it. Very quickly, maybe within the next 5 years or so, the government will not be able to pay its bills. Simply because in order to pay its bills, all its bills, it has to borrow enough to pay off all the old debt and all the new bills because it can't get enough from taxes to do that. It's going to have to borrow at such high rates that it won't be able to afford to do that anymore. Now, we don't know the exact timeline on this. Again, like I said, I think it'll probably be within the next 5 years. But the United States government has never faced a situation like this before. The closest we came was in the 40s after World War II. But the situation then, the spending could stop because the spending was on World War II. So yeah, the debt to GDP ratio got up to 120%, right about where we're at today. But as soon as the war ended, the spending stopped. And everybody came home from the war and we had a massive increase in productive output because we had a return to the labor force. It was a situation that could resolve itself. The situation we're in today, we have a bunch of locked in mandatory spending that isn't connected to anything like a war that we can just stop. We don't have a massive amount of workforce that can just come home and start contributing to productive output again. We don't have any of those situations, yet our debt to GDP ratio is there, and the refinancing of the debt and the skyrocketing interest rates is only making things worse. And the more they have to borrow, the higher they push interest rates up, which means they have to borrow even more, very quickly spiraling out of control. And the United States will be faced with either default on their expenses or their debt, or inflate away the debt and start printing money to cover it up again. We're heading into a deleveraging recession. It'll either be inflationary or deflationary, and I anticipate deflation first, then inflation for the long term.
Okay, that's quite a heavy start, obviously, of the conversation, but it's quite sobering as well. But in the meantime, you have the dollar. The dollar is the global reserve currency. That's what a lot of people still use, above I think 60% as a reserve. A lot of debts are also denominated in dollars. So, what effect will it have on the global markets, especially since the dollar is so prominent?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it depends on how they decide to move forward with this, because ultimately, like when we talk about this is just the process of a boom bust cycle. It's levering up and then deleveraging. Anytime you lever up, it is always followed by a deleveraging. The deleveraging can either be an inflationary deleveraging or a deflationary deleveraging, and it just comes down to policy choices. So if we look at in 1921, and in 1920, there was an 18-month depression. And at the time, they actually called it the Great Depression. It was because the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. We had artificially low interest rates. It caused this credit boom. It caused inflation. And then that boom led to a bust. When the bust started, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. They didn't lower interest rates to try and stimulate the economy. The federal government actually balanced the budget. Instead of spending more, they spent less. It was very painful. It was a deflationary deleveraging. There was a bust, economic pain everywhere you looked, a lot of unemployment, and it resolved itself in 18 months. Now, at that time, Hoover was in politics, and he said, if I'm ever in a position of power where I can do something about it, if something like this happens again, I will not stand by. I will spend money. We will try and do what we can to save the economy. He got his chance in 1929 when the next bust started, and he kept his promise and he started spending money. He didn't allow the government to balance the budget. He started going on, and FDR at the time actually said he campaigned on a laissez-faire campaign and said, hey, the government shouldn't be involved in trying to bail out the economy, stimulate the economy. This is the wrong approach. Hoover's doing a bad job with this. And then when he got into office, when he won the election, he actually doubled and tripled down on everything Hoover was doing. And so the history books have it completely backwards. They look at Hoover as the one standing by when FDR said, no, he's doing too much. And then when he got in, he did way more. And that depression
FDR
lasted.
Franklin Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt. Okay.
Yes. Franklin. Yeah. And so that one lasted a lot longer because of the government involvement. So the example of the 1921 depression is a deflationary deleveraging. And so the government does have a choice. If they wanted to, they could cut back spending enough where it would solve the problem. It's not like baked into the cake already. The problem is it's political suicide because you're cutting people off who have become dependent on the government. So because of that, I say that they just won't cut that spending. So the spending will continue to increase. And so as they spend that money and make the situation worse, then we have we're going right now into deflation. So inflation has been dropping from its official numbers 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, and now it's at 3. Very soon we're going to have negative inflation numbers. In my opinion, the market doesn't think that's going to happen, but I do. And that's going to be accompanied with a lot of economic pain. And then once the government is in trouble and can't pay its bills, that's when the Fed will flip. They'll start printing to fund the government's expenses again. And that's when we'll head back into inflation. And I think the inflation paired with higher rates for everybody will last at least a decade, but probably multiple decades.
Okay, So we're heading in general towards like higher inflationary periods. But in general, when you look at the state of the financial system, it's quite a big not I would say assumption, but in terms of analysis, that the leading economy in the world would basically not be able to pay its bill within the next 5 years. We see already, like in Japan, the Bank of Japan having like already like some trouble with their own debt, because they kind of came to a moment or a point where they're buying their own treasuries, or the Bank of Japan is buying its own treasuries directly. First, that's something that the Fed could not do because it's illegal for the Fed to do so in a direct way. But we've seen in the last couple of years, especially, that through indirect mechanisms, they actually are able to bypass this. And Jerome Powell just recently also said that this would never happen, to buy treasuries directly. But is it more of like then a moment when the US will be forced to change, let's say, the mandate of its own institution, financial institution, because we say of Japan as what Lynn Alden calls Japanification of finances and the way things happen, is that we look at Japan and if we kind of see a glimpse in the future in a way, which obviously you need to compare carefully because not everything is also the same. But are we heading towards the same fate of what Japan is experiencing? And could we maybe expect the Federal Reserve to change the mandate it's been given from the Congress at some point in history?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, it depends. Certainly, we could see it. So when you look back throughout history, the last 300 years or so, central banks usually start off as fairly independent in terms of they set monetary policy and they're not really influenced or influencing fiscal policy. Over time, as the financial situation of the economy in the country gets worse, many times you do see a blending and sometimes outright control of monetary policy by the central government. So sometimes that looks like a pure nationalization of the banking system. Sometimes that just looks like taking direct control of the central bank. It can look different ways. Right now, we have moved closer that direction. One example of moving closer that direction to a blending of monetary and fiscal policy is Janet Yellen's appointment as Treasury. She was obviously the head of the Federal Reserve for quite some time. And so we see closer working together between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury in a blending of monetary and fiscal policy. So you certainly don't need anything official to take place to see this flip back over. You could still see the banks operate as the middleman between the government and the Fed, like they have in the past for quantitative easing. And the banks will lend all the money to the United States government. As soon as they have the debt, they'll turn around and sell the debt to the Federal Reserve. So they'll get around the letter of the law, even though they're violating the spirit of the law, and the Federal Reserve can still finance the government's expenses that way. What you alluded to was the fact that Jerome Powell was kind of asked about this in a recent press conference. And they said, hey, the fiscal situation is getting worse. Will the Fed help the government refinance their debt? And he said, oh, no, under no circumstances. That could mean one of two things. Either he could have just been saying, no, that's illegal. We can't do that directly. We would never consider doing that. Or he was alluding to the fact that maybe the Fed is realizing that the situation is screwed unless the fiscal situation gets under control. So the Federal Reserve is not going to step back in with more QE or yield curve control, even if the fiscal situation gets worse. If that latter part is what he meant, then I would anticipate a complete legal folding of the Federal Reserve under the Treasury, or at least a rewriting of the Federal Reserve Act by Congress, because the Fed only exists because Congress says so, and they only do what they say. They only do what they're doing because Congress says so. We have to remember the Federal Reserve Act was written in the 70s. That's when they got their dual mandate, for maximum employment and stable prices. And so, absolutely, Congress, if it gets to a point where they say, "Hey, the U.S. is going under. We can't pay our bills unless we just rewrite the Federal Reserve Act and tell the Federal Reserve, your job is now to monetize the U.S. government's debt." and that's it. And if they do that, absolutely, then the Federal Reserve will have to do exactly what they say, and they will. And so it could happen a number of different ways. I don't know which way it will happen. I just have I think it's more likely than not, a high degree of probability that at some point, one way or another, the Federal Reserve flips and starts monetizing the U.S. government debt again.
Okay, by monetizing, you mean just buying the treasuries, matter which like the 2 years, the 6 month, the 10 years, the 30 years. That's what you mean by that. And then just like the Bank of Japan, that I think owns around 80% of treasuries from the Japanese government. But what would that mean in terms of for the markets? Because I mean, we've seen it kind of also for Japan already. The yen got bruised quite heavily every time those things happened. Now we see a change of policy that's quite interesting as well, of a new chairman of the Bank of Japan that kind of is seen as a more hawkish person compared to his predecessor, who is actually starting to change policies by using less yield curve control, and also thereby maybe hinting towards the possibility of, selling more and more of the US treasuries that Japan has been, I think, the biggest holder with China and some other countries of US treasuries, meaning that the market will be flood even more with treasuries. So what we've seen now with the current downgrade, actually it's the second downgrade in history of the US by Fitch, is that it's hinting towards more volatility and more trouble in the debt market, which you could say is the most important market there is at the moment, anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you make the comparison to what's happening in Japan, I think there are some similarities that are really important to take note of. The purchasing of the 10-year government bond in Japan by the Bank of Japan created a situation in which people were incentivized to sell it. That's why the Bank of Japan owns so much of their government's debt. Think my favorite way to explain this is, imagine Apple wanted to artificially increase the price of used iPhones. That's kind of the same thing as the Federal Reserve or a government wanting to artificially increase the price of its debt, which doing so decreases the interest rate on it. So Apple wants to increase the price of used iPhones. What they could do, this would be similar to QE. They could say, we're going to take $1 million a month and just go buy used iPhones on eBay. Well, that's just extra buying pressure. So that's going to lift prices up. There's more buyers now because of Apple's extra money. And what that would do is it would also incentivize some people to say, hey, if I've got a bunch of used iPhones, I didn't want to dump them on the market before because that would have pushed down prices. But now there's a new buyer, so I can sell more of my old used iPhones and it won't push down the price. So it incentivizes a little bit of selling. But yield curve control is qualitatively different. It's a different category of stimulus. Yield curve control is Apple coming in and saying, hey, we want to set the price of used iPhones at $1,000. Right now, you could buy used iPhones for $200, $300, $400, $500, but we want to set the price at $1,000. So that means any and every iPhone that somebody puts up for sale, we will pay $1,000 for it. That means that nobody will be able to buy a used iPhone for $900, because why would the seller sell it to you for $900 if they could sell it to Apple for $1,000? They wouldn't. And so when you set the floor under the price on something like an iPhone, that incentivizes a whole ton of selling, because now everybody realizes, I need to sell this right now while the selling is good, because I don't know how much longer this will last. I need to get rid of my supply of used iPhones because I'm making way more money than they're actually worth. And so it incentivizes a lot of selling, and Apple would absorb the entire market then of used iPhones. They would pay a lot for it, absolutely, and they would drain their cash. They would probably it'd probably be a very bad financial decision for them to spend their money that way. But they would set a floor underneath the price of used iPhones. And when you talk about something like yield curve control like Japan, bad financial decision to do this, to fund their government by setting a floor underneath the price of their bonds. The way that shows up as a bad financial decision is the value of their yen falling. So if you look at the yen versus something like the dollar, it's been falling off a cliff for a couple of years now. And that's why they're backing away from this policy, because if they keep on going down this road, eventually the yen hyperinflates. It's just not worth anything anymore. So they know they need to back off this policy. The United States government will be in the exact same situation with the Fed. Once they switch back over to QE or yield curve control or some sort of debt monetization, it will incentivize everybody around the world to sell the debt that they hold. Already, central banks for the last 10 years have flipped from net buyers to net sellers of U.S. treasuries. So people like Japan, China, others have been net buyers of treasuries for a very long time. Now they're all sellers. And so if the Fed comes in and says, we'll buy those treasuries from you at a higher price than what they're actually worth, that's only going to incentivize more selling. And so the Fed will then absorb most of the national debt. Most of the debt that the government owes will be owned by the Federal Reserve. At the end of the day, that's actually helpful for the government, because any profits that the Fed has get sent back to the government. So if the Fed can absorb all the national debt, they'd have a profitable balance sheet. They'd send the interest payments back towards the U.S. government. So in doing so, they would minimize the interest cost on the debt for the U.S. government, and also they would, be financing the actual debt itself. So it would be helpful for the U.S. government, but it would put massive downward pressure on the dollar versus other currencies.
And we've seen also now recently that a lot of countries like China, Russia, the BRICS in general, form like this alliance of a counterweight towards, let's say, what I would say G7 countries, the wealthiest countries in the Western Hemisphere. And are trying to also decouple from their dependency of the dollar. It doesn't mean necessarily that the dollar will die, but it definitely means that the dollar is losing in its power overall. What I find interesting, though, is a bit also the approach of the Fed and the function of central banks in general. You have this mug that you cannot see in this angle, but in a previous interview, you could actually see it, because there you go. And the Fed. A stupid question, simple question. Why and the Fed?
Well, the Federal Reserve, acting as a central bank, is doing a job that doesn't need to be done at the most basic level, number one. And number two, it enables everything we're talking about. And so it starts off very small, like you plant one seed, and then it grows into a tree, and then that tree has fruit, and each fruit has a bunch of seeds, and you plant all those, and eventually you have, a massive forest, all starting from one seed. But the beginnings are very small. And so there's this old proverb that says, do not despise the day of small beginnings. It's like the power of compounding interest over time. It works for good things and for bad things. And when you set precedents for bailing a system out, increasing moral hazard, subsidizing risk, subsidizing failure, and ultimately financing shortfalls in government spending, you create momentum going in the wrong direction. And in the beginning, it's very it looks benign because it's so small. It's just little tiny steps in the wrong direction. But then eventually you get to the point we're at right now, and it's like, this didn't happen because of the last year. It happened because of the last 100 years. And it just so happens that the first 94 of those years, the steps were so small that very few people noticed. And it's only the last couple of years that the steps, because of the compounding interest to the effects of the momentum that they've been on this path for so long, have gotten so severe. It's like an ice cube. You start off at zero. Okay, I'm talking in American
Fahrenheit.
units here. You start off at 0 degrees in American units. That's not. That's frozen. You warm up to 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. Nothing changes. It's still ice. All the way up to 32 degrees. It's still ice Fahrenheit. And then you tip over to 33 degrees, and bam, it's water. It's like, yes, technically it was that last degree that flipped the switch from a solid to a liquid, but you couldn't have gotten there if you didn't have the increase all the way from, 0 all the way up to 32 before that. A long way to answer the question of why end the Fed. Number one, they do that job that doesn't need to be done. They're there essentially to be a lender of last resort, which by it, inherently means they're there to subsidize failure. When a bank overextends itself and makes too many bad loans or takes on too much risk, that banks should be allowed to fail. Everybody who's responsible for it would never be entrusted to do that same job again. Everybody who lost something would be much more careful in the future with who they trust, and individual failure makes the entire system stronger. That's like, basic of how nature works in any complex system. Complexity dynamics. You have individual participants. If failure is allowed, the entire system gets stronger. Anytime you limit the consequences of individual failure, you make the entire system more unstable and more fragile, susceptible to collapse. And that's the job of the Federal Reserve. That's what they do. And it's just now that we're starting to see the effects of that really unfold on a grand scale.
Actually, it reminds me of a quote of President Andrew Jackson, who said, "I have had men watching you for a long time, and I'm convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and you lost. You charged it to the bank. You are then a vipers and thieves." Like, I think that's kind of like, there was also like the second time there was, it wasn't renewed anymore, the charter for the bank charter for the, back then, an attempt for a Federal Reserve. It wasn't called a Federal Reserve, but it was the second attempt to form a kind of Federal Reserve. And then it did form 80 years later, because it was around 1834, with the Federal Reserve. And that was 1913. What changed? Why do you think that all of a sudden this was possible, and what was recognized before was now becoming reality again?
Well, the central planners have always existed. There always have been and always will be people who want to exercise their control over other people, who want to ultimately, when you boil it down, use the monopoly on violence to force other people to do something they want them to do, seeking power for the sake of power. And there were three, like you mentioned, there were three attempts to start a central bank in the United States before the final one actually caught on. I don't know what was different about it. Part of it, I think, is probably the naming, making it seem as though it was a federal institution. Part of it was the safeguards that they put in place. They, with the debt ceiling and the outlawing of direct debt monetization, tried to make it seem like, that the big problems a central bank could pose to the system wouldn't be able to because of the safeguards they put in place. And then I think part of it was ultimately the desire to fund wars. Really, at the end of the day, you look at countries around the world, for most of history, when the gold runs out, the soldiers come home. The only way to continue to extend that is to loot and pillage your citizens, to get any and every bit of gold away from your citizens by force. But if you can take their purchasing power without them knowing it, you can fund the wars much longer and impose poverty on your citizens without having to go through and actually physically take their gold away from them. And that's what a central bank does. And that's why when you see the history of central banks starting in nations, it's always associated with funding massive wars that in terms of blood and costs are way higher, unprecedented, compared to that nation's history. And it's no different in the United States. And so I think part of it is the bloodlust, the desire to fund endless wars that ultimately got America to have a central bank that took hold.
Mm. Reminds me a bit of the, if you've read the book of Debt, the Last 5,000 Years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's like a passage in it about like the debt military slave complex that just describes this with Alexander the Great conquering other territories and financing this by paying his soldiers and also mercenaries with coins of silver that would be mined by slaves. And those coins were then imposed on conquered territories and create actually markets and economies by forcing the people through taxes. So then again, you create demand for those coins and perpetuating the cycles on and on and on. And today it's just a more sophisticated version of it. And now push this to another another dimension of it, is that now through technology we have, with the rise of CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, that's kind of like the next step, where we've just described now, okay, the system is reaching its limits. The central banks have different tools, but those tools now they're like blunt. They're not serving the purposes anymore, not as good as they used to, because we've seen all those incremental innovations of how central banks are able to kind of get away with things in a way, or trying to patchwork the economy or financial markets in general. It looks like that we're reaching a stage where through digitalization, we can do that through CBDCs, or at least central banks are exploring that path. If it's possible and if it's going to be implemented is another question. But then we also see more in the private sector. We've seen things with back then Facebook, with the Libra, and now with WorldCoin, aspiring for similar endeavors. What does it tell you, and what does it especially tell you about the future and where we're heading with those kind of tendencies or trends?
Yeah. So I want to be clear that even though I see in certain places and certain circumstances things getting worse in the short term, one of the kind of like the light at the end of the tunnel, the silver lining, however you want to look at it, is that the worse circumstances somebody imposes on a complex system, the more unstable and fragile they make it, which means that if things continue to go this direction, then ultimately they get bad so fast that they collapse and you have an escape on the other side even faster. And so what it looks like when you're talking about blunt instruments versus like scalpel-like approaches, fine tuning, we see the trend heading that direction. So it used to be, when there was a crisis, you lower interest rates. And that was enough to, broadly inject enough stimulus everywhere that it fixed that, one little crisis. And then it was lower rates and buy a bunch of government debt so the government can spend money. And then it was, instead of just doing that for, the financial system, we have to do stimulus checks and we have to lower rates for everybody, bail everybody out. And now, because that tipped over and almost reached kind of hyperinflation, the central bankers are saying, okay, well, we can't do broad-based stimulus when there's localized crises now. We have to be very focused and scalpel-like with our approach. And so in March, banks started to fail. They didn't lower interest rates. They didn't resume quantitative easing. They didn't do any of the normal playbook. What they did was they set up a new facility at the Federal Reserve to provide the funding to bail out just the depositors of just that bank. And so all of the deposits were saved. The shareholders were not. The bank went under, and the facility that they set up was there to ensure that another bank that got into the same situation would not be forced to sell its assets at fire sale prices. And so that was a very scalpel-like approach. That's why I think in this next crisis, when it reaches the government can't pay its bills, it's just going to be focused on the government. They're not going to apply broad-based stimulus. They're just going to focus on the government. If you play this out, you can see that the tools that they have are not designed for scalpel-like approaches for fine-tuning the economy. A central bank digital currency is. And so they're using sledgehammers to do surgery, to, remove an appendix. And those are not very good tools to do that. And so when we look at what a central bank digital currency is designed for, it's just unifying all the money onto one ledger. The advantage to that, to having every bank account under one bank, essentially under one roof, is that you can apply stimulus or the opposite in any way that you want. So, for instance, let's go back to 2020 and play this through the lens of like a central bank digital currency. everybody needs a stimulus check. Okay. So with a few strokes of the pen, we credit $1,000 to everybody's bank account. And we know, because all bank accounts are on one list, we know that we're not going to duplicate these. So we remove the fraud because every person has one account and there's no other banks that they could have an account at. We have all of their personal information. We know exactly who everybody is. So everybody gets their credit to their account. But, the last time people went out and spent that on, let's say, too much toilet paper. So we're going to put a ration in place where you can only spend X amount of dollars on toilet paper. And if you try and buy more toilet paper than that, your transaction just won't go through. And we can control that it won't go through because you're spending money, which is going to somebody else's bank account. We control their bank account as well. So we know what is being purchased and what is being sold. So we can institute real-time credits, real-time deductions, real-time rations, real-time taxes. We can cause stimulus to happen in one area. If we see businesses that are participating in these kinds of industries, they're starting to fail. We give everybody $1,000. It's like a gift card. It can only be used at that kind of business. We see shortages taking place with gasoline. Hey, you try and spend more than $400 a month on gasoline, your transaction won't go through. Shortage solved, right? So you have all of these fine-tuning controls over the system. And ultimately, it's financial tyranny. It's 100% authoritarian control over everything everybody does in an economy. So it's terrible. It will result in a lot of economic pain. You'll have a lot of errors made. Ultimately, in order to do that without it destabilizing and causing collapse, you need to have 100% of the information available. But that's not possible because the more control you exercise over a complex system, the more black markets will pop up. So they won't have all the information. Also, the information about prices are a result of subjective wants and needs. And that's not something that comes through in transaction data. And so you're going to be making decisions based off of flawed data. So you're going to make mistakes and errors on the entire system, which is very dangerous, very destabilizing. Number two, you have to have perfect kind of intentions, and there cannot be any moral bias in the decisions that are being made, which we know that in a system like that, it would automatically have to be tilted in one way or another, just due to human interests. Like, are we going to preference the government here? We're going to preference big banks. We're going to preference large corporations, because in a world where scarcity exists, you have to make compromises and decisions. Nothing has absolute abundance. And so the scarcity has to be allocated. And so the bias will result in incorrect decisions being made. Mm-hmm. And then finally, you have to have perfect control over the situation. And just like before I mentioned, black markets pop up. And so yes, you have control over the digital transactions, but because you can't control barter or black market transactions, physical cash transactions, gold or Bitcoin transactions, things like that happen outside the system or even in other nations, then again, you're not going to be able to implement everything you think you should. And so because those three deficiencies, it destines the system to collapse. It won't work long term. There will be economic pain along the way, but ultimately we'll have, freedom from it on the other side when it fails.
Okay, so in the bottom line, you don't see this happening.
I think it will happen. It just won't last very long.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you just mentioned gold as well as one way to ensure yourself against this type of system and also buy some freedom. The BRICS are kind of hinting towards that move of baking more and more of the currencies with gold. Is it something that you think will be more of like rejuvenation of some sort of a gold standard, or let's say a gold heavy driven era where people will more and more influx towards gold or want to own gold?
Yeah, good question. Statistically speaking, when you look back throughout history, you always see a return to gold in some fashion. And so I think if you're just looking at probabilistically speaking, there's a high degree, there's a good chance that gold starts being used as a form of money in some fashion at some point in the near future. I don't know exactly how that will look. When you look at what's going on with BRICS, there are some things that are exciting if you are somebody who likes gold, because you see nations talking about backing money up with gold again. That's always exciting if you're somebody who owns gold. There are some big problems with this, the so-called BRICS. They have, just to name a few, we have Russia and India fighting with each other right now because Russia has a ton of rupees that they don't want anymore. We see Russia and South Africa having big disagreements because Putin is apparently going to try and go to South Africa. South Africa is saying, you're going to force us to arrest you. Then Putin's saying, if you arrest me, then that's a declaration of war. And so they're saying, hey, if you come here, we're going to be forced to arrest you. And so who knows how much the media is overblowing the situation or, the exact things that are going on behind the scenes. But it's still, it highlights that this isn't like this isn't like a NATO, this isn't like a UN, this isn't like an organized group of nations that are completely unified in one purpose to dethrone the dollar. This is a loose association of nations that have a common financial enemy in the dollar, maybe, but are not really organized to the point of being able to trust each other with a unified currency backed up by a gold system that is inherently based on trust, because it's not going to be immediate physical delivery of gold. That's why you have a gold backed currency. So the currency is delivered and the ownership of the gold changes hands. So who is going to be the custody of this gold? How is the trust going to be implemented? Who's going to be verifying this? Who's going to make sure that no player in that system is not going to stab somebody else in the back and just confiscate all the gold? So there's a lot of questions to be asked here. Historically speaking, it doesn't really happen top down, especially when you look nation by nation. When a currency fails and you watch it play out over the course of years, the currency is replaced by a harder currency, many times gold, from a bottom up situation. So the people just start using, storing, hoarding gold again. And because of that, eventually gold is the only thing people accept as payment. So the government is forced then to reback their currency in gold, because if they want any purchasing power, they have to use the one thing that everybody is willing to accept, and because nobody's willing to accept anything else. So usually these things are a bottom-up process that the history books record as, hey, Germany rebacked its currency with gold again. They were forced to because people were already using it again. So if they wanted purchasing power, they had to use gold. They were forced into it. They wouldn't have chosen that otherwise, and we know that because they tried to not do that. It's just the history books record years in pages, and so it's hard to see that. And so I do think there's a very high chance that gold starts being used as money, or at least to more of a storage of value again by big players, by corporations, by institutions, by nations, by individuals. But I think it's more likely that happens as a bottom-up movement rather than a top-down imposition from nations that are not really very unified right now.
Great analysis. I haven't. I think it's quite refreshing because I didn't see it this way. I was expecting a much more actually optimistic outlook about like the corporation of BRICS and so on. But we're reaching the end of this interview. I would have, of course, loved to talk more. We're gonna, try to find another time in the future to continue this type of conversation. Thanks a lot, Joe, for your precious time and knowledge.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. It was fun.
And people can also, of course, subscribe to your YouTube channel. You have more than almost 220,000 subscribers. And this is for a reason, because you deliver regular quality content. And also you have 2 books. One is Heresy Heresy Finance. And
I think that that this book is the one that I'm most proud of. It's Why We Need the Fed. The subtitle is A Comprehensive Defense of the Federal Reserve, an Indispensable Guardian of Economic Stability. So this is a full defense of every reason why we need the Federal Reserve. And it's completely blank. So if you know anybody who needs a good
It's
a good Christmas
book.
gift, it is a gag book. There's a nice little description in there, some good chapter names, and it's completely blank. So if you know anybody that is looking for some good reasons why we need the Federal Reserve, that's a great book.
I tried to actually look into chapters and stuff, but you could just see the summary, and I was like, oh, okay, this must be paywall, Amazon something. But actually, you just revealed it. It's just literally a full-on gag book. I thought that at least you would fill in 100 pages of like sarcastically saying things about how bad it is, but written in a positive way, and then realizing, okay, actually, this positive and that's a positive in the end. But this is even funnier, I have to say. But that's the
reviews
great advice.
Are the best. If you look at the reviews on the book, it makes it even better.
Actually, I have to be honest. When I read the reviews, I thought like, "Hey, did he buy the reviews?" Or like, what? They did just so perfect and anything. Yeah. But this is the best part, actually. Like people are like playing along the game.
Those reviews are good. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thanks again, Joe, and wish you lots of success for your channel and all the rest in your life.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe. Leave your actions down below in the comment section. And if you want to watch more videos, feel free to check the most recent video, but also any other video that we've had published on the channel before. See you next time.